Today let's talk about getting together a brutal warband of heretics and traitors and starting Chaos Space Marines in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Chaos and doing a bit of an overview of getting a Chaos army together for 40k tabletop. They're a fun army, perhaps one of the big factions of Warhammer 40k, and recently they have received rather a lot of nice new models, plus a shiny new codex, which means that they can actually compete somewhat well in 9th edition. We'll talk over why you might want to collect Chaos, some of the first steps in planning an army, some ideas for expanding, and one example of a strong list in the current game. So first up, why would you want to collect Chaos in 40k in the first place? In general, out of the 40k armies, they are perhaps one of the ones with the most lore for them. Twisted traitors trying to overthrow the Imperium in honour of their dark gods, but each legion and warband has its own motivations and stories going back millennia, everything tying into the excellent Horus Heresy story, and each of the Primarch's individual force towards Chaos. In the 41st millennium, they might fight for all sorts of different goals, crusading against the Imperium, enacting great rituals, or simply to maim and cause terror on Imperial citizens, and their style of fighting is pretty interesting, having the best of Space Marine might, marched with favours from demons, and backed up by Hellforged war machines, uncanny creations of flesh, metal, and demon. It is pretty cool how much depth and flavour each legion has as well. There's the zealous evangelist word-bearers, the brutal gunnery of the Iron Warriors, or the twisted excess of the Emperor's children. Models-wise, I'd generally say that the Chaos Space Marine range is quite a good one right now, a fairly extensive range of miniatures, and a lot of the models have been redone, and fairly recently too. Generally quite a lot of the new kits have gone down quite nicely, whether they're the Havocs, Possessed, Terminators, or Standard Legionaries, and they are due to have a shiny new Demon Prince coming out in the near future as well. A few older kits do remain in their range, maybe at the moment most notably some of the tanks, some old characters and the bikes, but since the past few years and a bunch of kit releases, they're more of the exception rather than the rule. In game as an army they tend to be quite melee focused compared with their loyalist counterparts. Some solid shooting units do exist, but more of them tend to be geared towards cutting the enemy apart with swords or war-born appendages. And as an army they tend to lend themselves to big stacking synergies on big units, say like a lot of Terminators backed up by Chaos Marks, Psychic Spells, Stratagems and character buffs. They can reach a whole new level of scary both in terms of damage and defense. For stronger units they quite like their melee elites like Terminators and Possessed, and often have some very efficient characters hiding within their ranks, maybe a Lord Discordant, Demon Prince, the Master of Possession for buffs and reanimation, and of course Abaddon the Despoiler himself, who's absolutely lethal. In general, a few units do stand out for most armies, but each of the legions do have their different playstyles. The stratagems, warlord traits and relics do push you to field units in different ways. Overall, power-wise, I'd say they're a fairly solid mid-tier army. I've certainly seen a fair few tournament wins and success in recent days, though I wouldn't say that they're one of the top 5 armies in 40k right now. Finally, price-wise for an army to get into, I think they're fairly cheap as 40k goes. In general, armies that are fairly elite and character heavy do tend to help quite a bit in terms of getting points on the board. Maybe not quite as easy as Space Marines, who have crazy amounts of combat patrollers available if they want models at a discount. So if you are getting into Chaos Marines, perhaps the first port of call is to learn a bit more about the faction. It might not be a terrible idea to pick up Codex Chaos Marines early. It's got a fair bit of reading on the lore and background in the army, miniature galleries for a bit of inspiration for paint schemes and things, and of course the current rules for the army and how you might be able to field the models in game. Currently you only really need that book. If you wanted to play World Eaters at the moment, they have a White Dwarf supplement, though they are getting their codex in the near future. I would bear in mind as well, if it was Death Guard or Thousand Sons that you're looking for, they do have their own codexes, they aren't found in the Chaos Marine book. Then if you're planning armies and want to mess around with some rules, you could think about Battlescribe, Warhapedia or the Warhammer app. All of those can be ways to get the rules and mess around with a bit of list building, maybe giving you a bit more of an inkling of what Chaos Marine forces might look like on the table. You could potentially play some practice games with Tabletop Simulator or proxy models to see if you like the idea of them and like the way that they play, or just build up slowly and maybe start out with some combat patrol games. For getting a bit more info about the army from real collectors, you might think about looking up Chaos Space Marine Facebook groups, subreddits, Discord servers and other social media. There's lots of good places for advice, and they can be great places to ask noob questions as well, plus you just generally imbibe quite a bit just by scrolling through and seeing the different projects that people are working on and different questions that other people have about the army. Here on YouTube's a pretty good place for information as well. Lots of channels do battle reports showing the Chaos Marines in action. You can learn more about the lore or see army showcases just by searching what you want to see, It's quite a good place for painting guides as well. Just about all the major legions will be covered by multiple people. For Chaos Marine tactics things, I do have a fair few Chaos Space Marine videos myself, including a tier list, several unit reviews, and going through several of the legions individually. I'll certainly be making more in the future as well. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see any more Chaos Space Marine stuff from this channel. In any case, feel free to do any or none of that. But from that point I'd probably think about how you're going to paint things and what sort of rough army list you might be looking for. Once you've got a bit more of a handle on the rules, you could just try a bit of a first attempt at a 500 point combat patrol or 2000 point bigger army, just as a rough idea for roughly what you might want to aim at, though of course plans can always change as you become more educated as to what works or what you like. Perhaps one fairly major choice is which legion you're going to play. If you really do want to dedicate yourself to the theme and gameplay of one of the legions, then that's all well and good. If you paint them up as Iron Warriors, for example, having the game rules, the lore, and the paints might all be impacted a bit, so it is quite a big choice. You can just always paint things up in your own colour scheme though, and mix and match between the rules, and make up your own lore for a Renegade Warband, maybe a splinter of one of the legions. You could also think about whether you're going for a fairly balanced Chaos army, or you want to have a bit more of a skewed type one. Maybe you want to do Word Bearers and Field Mass Possessed with lots of Demon packs. Maybe you want to go for Iron Warriors and focus on armies and hordes of clanking Demon engines. Or perhaps you could go for a Terminator heavy force, maybe something like Black Legion and representing Abaddon's Bringers of Despair. Some of the strongest Chaos lists do tend to revolve around certain unit choices, perhaps say a big buffed up unit of Terminators, though you certainly don't have to go out and just play the best thing that lots of other people are playing. Then when you've got a bit of an idea of an army list together, I'd think about paint schemes and painting up a few small models. I'd recommend some troops choices for this. Probably Chaos Legionaries are about the most obvious go-to choice for Chaos. Best to practice a bit on something small and low stakes, and perhaps move on to characters and big stuff when you've actually got a scheme established that you know that you like. I would bear in mind that for Chaos Space Marines the kits can be just a little bit infamous for the amount of trim on some of the models. Say for example Helldrakes and this Forge Fiend here. If you are going for the two-tone effect, like say the black and gold here, it can take quite a while to pick out all the gold over the black undercoat. Moving on, let's talk first steps and actually picking up some miniatures. As always with these start collecting videos, I do like to underline the different ways in which you can pick up 40k miniatures. Direct from Games Workshop certainly is a fairly reliable and easy option, but also the most expensive. It's generally worth checking if there's local gaming stores either in your area or online that you can order through, as generally around the world they'll often give somewhere between a 10 and 20% discount on Games Workshop models, and they're all new and you get the exact same kit. For example, Element Games is one in the UK, I've got that links down in the video description below. It is an affiliate link, but you get a decent discount, and it doesn't cost you any more whatsoever from ordering through it. Typically they usually give about 15% off Games Workshop's miniatures for Warhammer in the UK. Otherwise, I'd certainly be aware that second-hand off eBay is a very viable alternative. You might have a little bit less freedom into how people have assembled the models, and some of them might need a little bit of work touching them up or repainting, but potentially that could be a shortcut to saving a fair bit of money and also a fair bit of time and effort potentially, if you don't mind dealing with pre-assembled minis. Finally, bear in mind that 3D printing and third-party miniature makers are an option. Games Workshop wouldn't allow them in their stores, but if you don't play there regularly, it's not exactly a big deal. There's lots of great independent sculpts that exist that could easily represent something similar to Chaos Space Marines and be perfectly functional in a game of 40k. Maybe perhaps one of the most notable alternate suppliers of Chaos Space Marines are the Ravage Star Veil Touch from Mini Wargaming. I've at least heard a fair bit of positive noise about them online. If you are aiming to keep things mainly from the Games Workshop Chaos range though, I think the first steps that you'd be wanting to take would be to get the core of your army together. Good miniatures to start out with are ones that you think you'll use in just about every game, either due to how good they are or how necessary they are for the army, like troops perhaps. Any particular fun models that really draw you to the army, as that'll help you with inspiration, and I'd certainly have a nod to any things that are particularly cheap and get you quite a lot of minis on the table for a reasonable cost, such as the Combat Patrol box set. Combat Patrol Chaos Space Marines is this set on the right. It comes with a Dark Apostle and his 2 Hanger-On Disciples, 5 Havocs with their heavy weapons, 10 Legionaries, though I would bear in mind it doesn't come with their Kill Team upgrades, and 1 Chaos Hellbrute, the multi-part one with all the different guns. Games Workshop sells this set at £90, €120 or $150, and overall I'd say it is a pretty reasonable place to start Chaos Marines, gets you a fair chunk of force on the board at around about a 32% discount, fairly standard for Games Workshop's combat patrols. I'd say that every one of the units here is at least usable. Nothing's outright bad, even if it might not be absolutely tip-top tournament optimal. I feel like it's a solid core that you could build towards an army, and then add more and more things that you either like or are effective in game. I would bear in mind as well that there's been other Chaos Space Marine discount boxes in the past. In particular, the old Start Collecting Chaos Space Marines box set really is a great deal if you can still find it, though supply in general will just be limited to a few third-party retailers, as Games Workshop don't stock it directly. That's the one that comes with the Venom Crawler, Master of Possession, and a few other bits and bobs like Obliterators. I guess the Greater Possessed would now be unit fillers though, as their unit just got folded into the standard Possessed squad. There's also been past Christmas box set deals in the past, such as the Decimation Warband. Again, there might be some of those going online or in individual stockists if you find one. Otherwise, if you just wanted to dip your toe in, maybe something like a standard kit of Legionaries or Terminators might be a reasonable start. I'd probably get a unit of troops and an HQ of your choice at least fairly early, and then build out from there into a patrol detachment that you can have small games with. Moving on, when you've got a small force established, you can think about expanding outwards, and these would be some of the things that I most consider adding on to the rest of the army. Having a few cultists about is a pretty reasonable choice, some cheap action doing grunts to sit on objectives while the Chaos Marines go off and do the exciting things. I'd probably go for the cultist mob with the 10 models rather than that slightly weird and unhelpful 8 model kit, and you could think about that kill team for traitor guardsmen as well. That gives you a different sort of vibe, and I'd just arm them with the las guns to counter the cultist firearms. I think fairly early on I'd also want some hard-hitting melee of some sort, seeing as it is basically what Chaos Space Marines do best. Terminators and Possessed are both pretty standout units, Chosen are pretty solid as well, as are Warp Talons. You'd want something to be some of the primary damage dealers to act on the front lines and cut down enemy elite infantry. If you want some fire support, Havocs I think are fairly solid. You could give them the Mark of Slanesh and have that stratagem for automatic 6 damage, which is pretty cool. Plus they're at least fairly hard to kill with toughness 5 as well. If you want to field some of the Cult Marines like Plague Marines or Rubric Marines, I would bear in mind that their rules come in the Death Guard or Thousand Sons Codex, which is a bit unhelpful. They can be quite useful squads though, particularly Rubric Marines along with the Let the Galaxy Burn rule. Otherwise, to lead the force besides support characters, I'd really quite want to get my hands on at least 1 or 2 of the big damage type characters, maybe Abaddon the Despoiler, the Lord Discordant, or the Demon Prince. For the latter, I'd probably be tempted to wait until the actual new model for the Demon Prince comes out, which shouldn't be all that long. Obviously, I bear in mind any lore or theme that you have for the Legion. You could certainly go for tank-heavy Iron Warriors if you wanted to, or sneaky cultist-heavy Alpha Legion. If you are interested in how strong units are in-game, I'll link my tier list of Codex Chaos Space Marine units down in the video description. Though I would bear in mind in 40k rules things do have a habit of going up and down in points, so what is optimal at the moment might not necessarily stay that way. Otherwise, for expanding the army, there's plenty of options. You could think about allies such as Demons or Chaos Knights. They're both workable as they don't break the overall army rules in the right situation. Could give you a bit of a different flavour of Chaos Marines if you're taking them alongside, say, some allied demons deep striking in and casting warp fire everywhere. If you want a bit of a different flavour of Chaos Space Marines, I'd also bear in mind that there's some unit choices and options in the Forge World Imperial Armour Compendium. Things like Chaos Contemptor Dreadnoughts and Leviathans are quite popular, both of which also got quite nice new Games Workshop kits, and you can absolutely use them in the Chaos Space Marine roster. Otherwise, things like Dreadclaw Drop Pods and Decimators are both okay. As well as just units, I would bear in mind as well that Forge World and the Horus Heresy range can both be quite good for aesthetics as well. There's not all that much Legion specific stuff in the actual 40k range, but there's quite a decent amount in Horus Heresy. It can be really quite a fun way to get, say, some Night Lords themed Terminators or characters, and different custom heads or shoulder pads for your various legions. I would bear in mind that Forge World resin prices do tend to be really quite expensive over and above Games Workshops. Finally, just to finish up, here's just one example of what a strong Chaos Space Marine list could look like on the table. There have been plenty of tournament winning lists, but I did quite like this one by Russell Tassin. He used it to take 13th at the Lone Star Open, only losing 1 game out of 6 and coming 13th at an 180 person event. This one feels like a fairly well-rounded, strong Chaos list at the moment. 3 enormously fighty characters in Abaddon, a souped-up Demon Prince, and the Lord Discordant, and each of those have brutal mechanics for not taking too much damage in one phase and basically being guaranteed to survive a turn. There's then a huge unit of Terminators with the Black Rune of Damnation, which are monstrously hard to kill, and they can be supported by the Master of Possession, who can both make them even tougher and heal them when they die, which is pretty brutal. Then for other big melee threats, there's a big unit of Chosen as well, 2 units of 5 Possessed for fast-moving, hard-hitting units, and then a few small units for jumping around on objectives, a couple of cultist mobs, one squad of legionnaires which Black Legion can use well, and 3 chaos bikers. Overall a strong and well-rounded Black Legion list, a scary battle line full of melee monsters, and then 3 enormous hidden character threats lurking within. So anyway, I hope that's been at least some help towards getting an army of Chaos Space Marines together and burning down the Imperium on the tabletop. As always with these videos, if there are any experienced Chaos Generals watching this, please feel free to leave us any comments or good tips down in the comment section. Always good to be able to help out new players if you do have a few gems of experience. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly be aiming to keep a good few more Chaos videos coming. Certainly looking forward to going through the legions and reviewing a few more units. Finally, if you have found the video useful, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, which is how I can afford to create content like this quite so regularly. Making all these guide videos does take a fair amount of time and effort, and if you have found it useful, any support is enormously appreciated in keeping more coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.